Imagine for a second that you are standing in the middle of a massive roaring crowd.
Oh, that's a terrifying thought.
Right. But just, like, picture it. Everyone around you is cheering for the exact same thing. You feel the energy rolling off the people next to you.
Yeah, your heart starts racing.
Exactly. And before you even realize what's happening, you're cheering too. You feel completely convinced, like completely certain, that you have made an independent, rational choice to join in.
Even though you totally haven't.
Exactly. But what if you could suddenly see the invisible strings that pulled you into that crowd? What if you could see the exact mathematical architecture of the argument that just bypassed your rational mind and hijacked your brain?
I mean, it's a really uncomfortable thought. We all like to believe that our reasoning is, completely autonomous, like it's a fortress of pure rationality that we control.
But it's not.
No, not at all. The reality is the architecture of persuasion is often entirely invisible to us while we are inside it. We don't see the structural beams, we just feel the pull to agree.
And that invisible architecture is exactly what we're exposing today. We are welcoming you to a very special deep dive where we are opening up the second half of a classic, incredibly dense Arabic manuscript on logic.
It's a fascinating text.
It really is. It's called Principles of Logic and the Science of Reason.
Yeah.
It was completed in the year 849 of the Hijri calendar.
Which puts it roughly around 1445 CE.
Right. And just to be super clear about our mission today, we are skipping the first half of this manuscript entirely.
Yeah, the first half deals with basic definitions, simple sentences, the ABCs of logic. We really don't need that.
No, we don't. The second half is where the gloves come off. This is the fascinating and honestly sometimes dark underbelly of complex real-world arguments.
It's all about how arguments are built and, weaponized to persuade or manipulate masses of people.
Yeah, and the specific traps our own brains just naturally fall into. Moving from the first half to the second half is...
It's like moving from learning how a single block is fired in a kiln to learning how an entire labyrinth is engineered to make you walk in a very specific direction without realizing it.
That is a perfect way to put it. The author is synthesizing centuries of philosophical debate here and laying out the absolute rules of human thought.
And this isn't just ancient history.
No, not at all. Because whether you are, negotiating a tough contract, listening to a slick political speech, or just arguing with a friend about where to eat dinner, you are swimming in the exact logical frameworks this 15th century text decodes.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Where do we start?
Well, to understand how masses are persuaded, which we will definitely get to, we first have to look at the invisible structural beams of these complex arguments.
Right. The text moves away from simple statements to what it calls conditional propositions.
In Arabic, the term is shartiya.
Yeah, and a conditional proposition is essentially the foundation of all complex reasoning. You're no longer just making a flat declaration like, the sky is blue.
You're connecting two separate ideas. Exactly. You are building a bridge. And the text breaks this down brilliantly. The first beam we need to look at is the connected conditional, known as the mutasala.
Which is just your classic if-then statement, right?
Yes. It has an antecedent, which is the if part, and a consequent, the then part.
So, like, if it rains, then the ground gets wet.
That's a perfect standard example, but, the manuscript doesn't stop there. The author makes an incredibly sharp distinction regarding why the then follows the if.
And this is where most people get tripped up today.
Oh, constantly. He divides these if-then statements into two categories. The first is luzumia.
And that represents a relationship of absolute logical necessity, right?
Exactly, meaning the connection is unbreakable.
So if I say, if this shape is a triangle, then it has three sides, the essence of the antecedent necessitates the consequent. It's impossible for it to be otherwise.
Yes, the essence of the thing itself forces the outcome. But the second category, ittifaqiya, represents a relationship of mere coincidence, and this is where things get really dangerous.
Give me an example of that.
An example would be, if the sun is shining, then my neighbor is mowing his lawn. The sun shining didn't force the neighbor to mow the lawn.
Right. There is no absolute universal law of physics demanding that outcome.
No, they just happen to be true at the same time.
I mean, I see this constantly in modern data analysis and journalism. People look at a graph, they see two lines going up at the exact same time, and they immediately publish an article screaming, look, A causes B.
Yeah, they treat a coincidence as a necessary truth.
Like the classic example where ice cream sales and shark attacks both go up in July. If you treat that as a luzumia, an absolute necessity, you'd think eating ice cream summons sharks.
Which is obviously absurd.
Right. But it's just an itiphakia, a coincidence driven by a third factor, which is summer weather. It's wild that 15th century logicians were already putting warning labels on that exact cognitive trap.
They really understood that the if-then structure is powerful, but it is entirely dependent on the invisible tether connecting the two halves. If you let an opponent convince you that a coincidence is actually a necessary truth.
You've already lost the debate before it really begins.
Exactly.
Let's look at the next structural beam, because this one requires some serious mental gymnastics.
Yeah, it does.
The text moves from if-then to either-or propositions. These are known as the munfasila, or disjunctives.
The famous either-or.
Yeah. And when I was reading through this section, it felt like trying to order off a wildly strict, complicated restaurant menu.
That's a good analogy.
The text outlines 3 intensely specific types of either-or scenarios. I really want to try and map these out using that restaurant analogy because the classical examples can get a bit abstract.
I like that approach because, the classical logicians map these out with mathematical precision because confusing them is a primary source of fallacious reasoning.
Right. So the first type is the true disjunction, the hakia.
And this is the absolute strictest form of either-or. It must be mutually exclusive and exhaustive.
So in our restaurant analogy, this is like being handed a strict prefix menu where the waiter tells you, for your main course, either you order the chicken or you order the fish. Those are the only 2 items in the kitchen.
And applying the rules of Hakia, it means it must be one, it cannot be both, and it cannot be neither.
So if you try to order both the chicken and the fish, the waiter says no.
Right. And if you try to order neither and ask for a steak, the waiter also says no. It is a hard, inescapable binary.
Does the manuscript use a mathematical example for this?
It does. It uses a classic one. Either this number is even or it is odd. There is no secret third option, and a number cannot be both.
Okay, that one feels pretty intuitive. It's the standard way we think of either or. But the second type is where the nuances start to really layer in.
Yeah, type 2 is called maniac jam, which translates roughly to prevent combination.
Prevent combination, all right.
In this scenario, you cannot have both, but you could have neither.
Wait, how does that work? You cannot have both, but you could have neither.
The author uses the example of an object's identity. He says, either this object is a tree or it is a stone.
Okay, let me run that through the restaurant filter. This is like a menu that says you can either use your 20% student discount or your 20% senior citizen discount.
Okay, I see where you're going.
The rule is preventing the combination. You cannot stack the discounts and get 40% off. You can't be both a student and a senior at the exact same time in this context.
But could you be neither?
Yes. You could just be a 35-year-old paying full price. The rule doesn't force you to use a discount. It only prevents you from combining them.
That's a great way to look at it.
It's just like the text's example. An object cannot be a tree and a stone at the same time. The combination is physically prevented, but it could easily be a bird or a river or a human. It could be neither.
That is a really crucial distinction. It guarantees they won't overlap, but it doesn't guarantee that one of them absolutely must be true of any given object in the universe.
Okay, what's the third type?
And then we reach the mirror image of that, which is type 3, maniac kulu, or prevent absence.
Prevent absence.
Yeah, this is notoriously the trickiest one for the human brain to process quickly. In this type, you cannot have neither, but you could easily have both.
Cannot have neither, but can have both. Let me try to build a restaurant scenario for this.
Go for it.
Imagine a nightclub with a strict minimum spend rule. The bouncer tells you either you pay a $50 cover charge or you buy a $50 drink.
Okay.
You cannot do neither. If you try to walk in without paying the cover and without buying a drink, you get kicked out. The absence of both is prevented.
Right.
But you could absolutely pay the $50 cover charge and buy a $50 drink. The club would love that. You can have both.
That works perfectly. The manuscript's example for this requires a bit of parsing, though.
What is it?
It says, either this thing is not a human or it is not a horse.
Whoa, let's slow down and process that. Either it is not a human or it is not a horse. So it cannot be neither. If it were neither, meaning it failed both conditions, that would mean it is a human and it is a horse at the same time.
A human-horse hybrid.
A centaur, which doesn't exist in reality. So the absence of both conditions is logically prevented.
But could a thing be both not a human and not a horse?
Yes, a rock is both. It fulfills the condition of not being a human, and it fulfills the condition of not being a horse.
Exactly. This type of proposition forces at least one truth, but it leaves the door open for multiple truths.
I have to admit, I struggle to see why someone in 1445 would spend so much ink differentiating these. I mean, it's a fun intellectual puzzle, but if I'm a merchant in a bazaar or a vizier advising a sultan, why do I care about the difference between a true disjunction and a prevent combination?
I get why it feels like we are losing the forest for the trees here.
It really does.
But it might feel that way, but understanding these distinctions is the ultimate defense mechanism in a high-stakes negotiation or debate. Trapping an opponent relies heavily on framing an argument using the wrong kind of either-or. Think about modern political rhetoric.
Okay.
A politician stands at a podium and declares, either we drastically raise taxes on the middle class, or our entire public education system collapses. What are they doing?
They are framing it as a type 1, a hakia, a true disjunction. They want the public to believe those are the only two choices in existence, and that they are mutually exclusive.
Precisely. They want you to panic and choose the lesser evil. But if you understand the structural beams of logic, you can look at that statement and realize it's an illusion.
Because it's not a true disjunction.
Right. It is a type 2, a prevent combination, or perhaps even neither. There are dozens of other options. You could restructure the budget, audit existing spending, introduce new corporate tariffs.
So by treating a multi-option scenario as a strict binary, the politician is performing a sleight of hand.
Exactly. And if you know the architecture, you don't fall for the trap. You can dismantle the premise before you even have to argue the details.
That makes a lot of sense. You name the trap to disarm it. Okay, so we've looked at the foundational structural beams, the if-thens and the either-ors,
Yeah.
but you can't live in a pile of beams.
No, you have to build a house.
Right. The text shifts gears here and moves into the grander mechanics of thought. It asks, how do human beings actually generate new knowledge from existing facts?
And it lays out 3 primary methods for scaling up our logic.
Let's talk about those. These are the engines of discovery.
The author categorizes them as induction, analogy, and deduction. Each has a specific function, and more importantly, each has specific limits on how much certainty it can actually provide.
Let's start with induction, or istikra. The way I understand this, induction is moving from the particular to the universal. You look at a bunch of specific individual things on the ground and you draw a big overarching rule from them.
That is the basic movement, yeah. But Al-Wargami makes a vital distinction here that essentially defines the boundary of human scientific endeavor.
What's the distinction?
He divides induction into complete induction and incomplete induction. Complete induction is rigorous but rare. It requires you to survey every single instance of a phenomenon before making a rule.
So if I want to claim every book in my office is written in English, I have to pick up every single book, check the language, and put it down.
Exactly. If you do that, your conclusion is absolutely certain.
But in the real world, outside of a closed room, complete induction is basically impossible. I mean, you can't survey every single tree on Earth to make a rule about trees.
Which brings us to incomplete induction. This is the reality of human existence. We survey a few instances, or maybe a few thousand, and we guess the rest.
Right. We observe 100 swans in our local lake. We see they're all white, and we formulate the universal rule. All swans are white.
And that rule serves you perfectly well year after year until you travel to Australia and see a black swan.
Right. In an instant, the universal rule shatters. Because you didn't observe every swan in the universe, your rule was never actually a certainty. It was just a high probability. This is the famous black swan problem in philosophy.
So if incomplete induction only ever yields probability, why do logicians even bother with it? Why rely on a flawed tool?
Because without it, society would freeze. We simply cannot function without probabilistically predicting the future based on past particulars.
That makes sense.
And the text acknowledges this and provides a fascinating historical application. It points to early Islamic scholars like Al-Ghazali and Ibn al-Hajib, who used incomplete induction not for philosophy but for Arabic grammar.
Wait, really? That's unexpected. How does logic apply to linguistics?
Well, they wanted to codify the rules of the Arabic language, but they couldn't magically interview every single Bedouin Arab who had ever lived to see how they constructed sentences.
Right, obviously.
So they surveyed as many tribes as they could. They tracked speech patterns, case endings, poetry. They used incomplete induction to gather a massive amount of particular data points, and from that, they induced the universal rules of Arabic grammar that are still studied today.
Wow.
It wasn't mathematically absolute because they didn't survey everyone, but it was practically necessary. That's brilliant. So induction is particular to universal. The second method is analogy, or tamthil.
Yeah.
And this is moving from one particular directly to another particular. You're essentially saying situation A is like situation B, therefore the rule for A should apply to B.
Exactly.
And the text explicitly highlights this as the realm of the jurists, the scholars of Islamic law, the fiqh.
It is the absolute lifeblood of any legal system based on historical precedent. Because when you are dealing with ancient texts or constitutions, you are inevitably going to encounter a new situation that simply didn't exist when the law was written.
You can't just wait for a universal rule to fall from the sky.
No, you have to find a historical precedent.
Think about early internet laws in the 1990s. Someone hacks into a server and steals data. At the time, there were no specific laws about cyber theft.
Right.
So a prosecutor uses analogy. They stand up in front of a judge and say stealing digital data via a modem is legally analogous to the wire fraud laws from the 1930s involving telegrams. They map the new particular onto the old particular.
The modern parallel is exact. However, the manuscript issues a severe warning about analogy.
What's up the warning?
It is a highly volatile tool. For an analogy to be logically sound, the similarity between the two particulars cannot just be superficial. It must be based on the illat,
The collet.
the underlying cause or reason for the original rule. If the prosecutor says internet theft is like wire fraud because both involve electricity, that's a weak analogy.
Right, that's entirely superficial.
But if they say it's analogous because both involve using telecommunication infrastructure to deprive someone of property without physical trespass, the underlying cause matches.
Ah, I see.
If the cause doesn't match, the analogy collapses into a fallacy.
Okay, so induction gives us probability and analogy gives us practical precedent, but neither gives us pure certainty.
No, they don't.
Which brings us to the heavyweight champion of classical logic, deduction, or kias. This is the inverse of induction. It moves from the universal down to the particular.
What's fascinating here is how much classical logicians revered deduction. In our modern practical lives, we rely heavily on experience and comparison. But for Al-Wargami and the scholars of his era, induction and analogy were considered intellectually inferior.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, deduction is the only engine of thought that can provide airtight, unquestionable mathematical certainty.
Because if you establish a true universal rule, whatever falls under it must be true. It's the classic Aristotelian syllogism.
Right.
The major premise is universal. All humans are mortal. The minor premise is particular. Socrates is a human. Therefore, the conclusion is inescapable. Socrates is mortal.
You don't have to wait around for Socrates to die to prove it.
Exactly. The architecture of the statement guarantees the truth of the conclusion before the event even happens.
That predictive certainty is why it was considered the pinnacle of reasoning. But this raises a profound issue, and it acts as the pivot point for the entire manuscript.
Okay.
We know the structures. We have the if-then beams. We have the deductive engine. But what materials are we putting into this engine?
Right. You can build a flawless deductive structure, a perfect syllogism, but if you build it out of wet cardboard, it's going to collapse the second you lean on it.
Exactly.
If your major premise is all humans can fly, the logic is structurally sound, but the material is garbage.
And this is where the manuscript elevates from a dry textbook on structural logic into a profound psychological and sociological study. The author reveals that not all premises are created equal.
No, they're not.
The text categorizes all human argumentation into 5 specific arts based purely on the material, the mawad, that is used to build the premises.
This is the 5-tier hierarchy of human persuasion. And for you listening, this is the absolute core of our deep dive.
Right.
This is the matrix.
Truly.
Once you understand the differences between these 5 tiers, you will never listen to a commercial, a political debate, or even an argument with a family member the same way again. It completely demystifies how we are influenced.
It really does.
Let's start at the very top. Tier 1. Demonstration or burhan.
Demonstration is the gold standard of human thought. It is the realm of absolute, unshakable truth. An argument built in this tier yields 100% certainty.
100%.
It leaves zero room for doubt or debate. But because the standard is so high, you cannot just use any premise you want.
Right.
The text explicitly outlines 7 foundational sources, 7 types of raw material that are strong enough to support a true demonstration.
I want to spend some time on these 7 sources, because looking at what a 15th century scholar considered absolute truth gives us a fascinating window into the history of human knowledge.
Let's do it.
The first source is axioms, the Bediayat.
Axioms are self-evident mathematical or logical truths. The text gives the example. 1 is half of 2.
You don't need to run an experiment to prove this.
No, you don't need to consult a focus group. The very moment your mind conceptualizes what 1, half, and 2 mean, the truth of the statement is undeniable. It is the structural reality of the universe.
Okay, the second source is sensory data. Masusat, fire is hot, or the sun is bright.
Now, I can imagine modern philosophers arguing about the limits of perception, whether we can trust our eyes, the whole brain in a vat simulation theory.
Sure, yeah.
But for classical logicians, direct sensory experience under normal conditions was considered an absolute bedrock of truth.
They were pragmatic.
Very. While there are visual illusions, the fundamental sensation of heat from a flame is undeniable to the person experiencing it.
Which leads directly to the third source. Internal sensations, or Wijnaniat. This one is interesting because it's entirely subjective, yet categorized as absolute truth.
The text's example is, I am hungry, or I am in pain.
It is subjective, but it is internally absolute. No one can logically debate you out of your own hunger.
Right, they cannot present a syllogism that proves your headache doesn't exist. Your internal awareness of your own state is a primary truth that requires no external validation.
The fourth source is where my mind was completely blown reading through the translations. It's empirical or repeated trials, the tajribiat.
This is essentially the early scientific method woven directly into formal logic.
Yes. And the specific textual example the author uses is so perfectly grounded in its era. Scammony purges yellow bile.
That is a brilliant historical artifact. Scammony is a plant extract that was heavily used in classical and medieval medicine as a potent purgative.
What's crucial here is why it's included as a source of absolute truth.
Exactly. The logicians didn't just accept this on faith from older texts. They categorized it as an empirical truth because doctors had tested it repeatedly, trial after trial, across diverse populations, consistently observing the same result.
They recognize that sustained, documented empirical observation elevates a claim from a guess to a foundational logical premise.
It shows that their logic wasn't just abstract philosophy trapped in an ivory tower. They were looking at medical data and integrating it into their models of truth.
The fifth source is similar. Intuition or observation, Hadsiat. The example here is, the moon's light is acquired from the sun.
Think about the depth of that observation for the 15th century.
It's amazing.
Intuition in this context doesn't mean a random gut feeling. It means a rapid intellectual realization based on sustained observation. By watching the phases of the moon and correlating them geometrically with the position of the sun, the mind intuits the unshakable truth that the moon is reflecting light, not generating it.
And once intuited, it becomes a premise strong enough for a demonstration.
Exactly.
Now, the final two sources are where things get slightly complex. The sixth is mass-transmitted facts, or mutawatirot.
These are things so widely reported by so many diverse, unconnected people that it becomes mathematically impossible for them to be a coordinated lie.
It's the philosophy of consensus. How do you know the continent of Antarctica exists if you have never personally been there?
You haven't used your senses, you haven't run an experiment.
You know it because of mass transmission. Thousands of independent sources, maps, explorers, satellite images, scientists all confirm it. The sheer volume and diversity of the reports eliminate the possibility of fabrication, elevating it to an absolute truth.
And the seventh and final source is innate concepts. This refers to ideas built into the human hardware.
Like what?
Things like the concept of existence or the impossibility of a thing simultaneously existing and not existing in the same way at the same time.
You don't learn these. Your brain operates on them natively.
Right. So those are the 7 materials of Tier 1. If you build your argument using only those, you have a flawless demonstration.
But here's the problem. Human beings rarely walk around speaking in mathematical axioms and empirical medical data.
Which is why we descend to Tier 2, dialectic or jadal. This is the art of formal debate.
It is a step down from the absolute certainty of demonstration.
You use dialectic when you need to defeat a stubborn opponent, defend a dogma, or prepare someone's mind to eventually accept a higher truth.
But if dialectic doesn't use absolute facts, what material is it building with?
It uses what the text calls mashurat, which translates to widely accepted societal norms or popular opinions. Instead of starting with 1 is half of 2, you start with moral or social premises. The text gives examples like, justice is good, oppression is bad, or exposing nakedness is shameful.
Okay, let me push back on this. Justice is good feels like an absolute truth. Who on earth would argue that justice is bad? Why isn't that in Tier 1 with the axioms?
Because that is the profound illusion of dialectic. These concepts feel like absolute truths because you have been socially conditioned to accept them since birth.
Oh, interesting.
But mathematically, logically, they are not universal. If I say fire is hot, that is a sensory fact, regardless of whether a human being is there to experience it. A rock rolling into a fire will get hot.
Right.
But justice requires human definition. It requires a society to agree on what is fair and what is oppressive.
And the example of nakedness is shameful makes this even clearer. If you put a human alone on a desert island, nakedness has no moral weight. It means nothing.
Precisely. The text notes a vital insight here. Every culture has its own unique set of masharat. What works perfectly as an undeniable premise and a dialectical debate in one society might completely fail in another.
Wow.
If you travel to a historical society where communal public bathing is the norm, the premise nakedness is shameful loses all its power, the logic fails, not because the structural syllogism is wrong, but because the societal norm is no longer accepted by the audience.
Dialectic is incredibly effective, but it's entirely tethered to the culture you are speaking to.
Exactly.
Think about the implications of that for modern discourse. It explains why debates across deep political or cultural lines often feel like screaming into a void.
Yes, absolutely.
You have two people using flawless Tier 2 dialectic, but they're building with completely different masharat. They're using different societal norms as their foundational premises. No wonder they can't convince each other.
You're speaking different logical languages.
All right, let's descend further. Tier 3, rhetoric, the kataba. This is about persuading the masses.
The author explicitly notes that rhetoric is designed for the general public, the al-awam. When you are speaking to a massive crowd in a city square or broadcasting to millions of people, you cannot use dense, multi-step demonstrations.
You will lose their attention immediately.
And you might not even have the time for the structured back and forth of a dialectical debate. Instead, you use rhetoric.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because unlike Tier 1 or Tier 2, rhetoric doesn't even try to strictly prove anything. It only needs to convince. It is entirely outcome-oriented.
Rhetoric uses accepted or merely probable premises. It leans heavily on appeals to authority, the speaker's own charisma, and likely outcomes.
It's all about the result.
It is designed to create a strong, immediate conviction in the listener's mind. A conviction strong enough to trigger action, even if the logical foundation underneath is actually quite shallow or unproven.
This is the tier where modern advertising and political campaigns live and breathe.
Oh, entirely.
Think about a high-end car commercial. They don't give you a geometric demonstration of the engine's thermal efficiency. They don't debate the ethics of transportation.
No, they show a sleek car driving along a beautiful coastal highway at sunset.
With an attractive driver looking perfectly serene, they're using probable premises. People with expensive cars are admired, or driving this car will make you feel free.
Right.
They are persuading the masses by operating purely in Tier 3.
And it is worth noting that classical logicians didn't necessarily view rhetoric as evil or deceitful. They viewed it as a practical civic necessity.
Really? How so?
Well, if a city is suddenly under attack, the military commander doesn't have time to logically demonstrate the necessity of defense using axioms and complete induction.
That would take forever.
Exactly. They need to stand on a wall and use rhetoric, appealing to patriotism, family, and survival to inspire the public to pick up swords immediately. Rhetoric moves the masses to action.
But then we take a dark turn. We move into Tier 4, and the text plunges into deep psychological territory. Tier 4 is poetry, or sheer. And the author doesn't just mean nice rhyming couplets. He describes poetry as a complete emotional hijack.
It is the bypass valve of the rational brain. The text describes poetry as utilizing imaginative fictional concepts, mukhayalat, to create deep involuntary psychological desire or aversion.
It has nothing to do with truth.
None whatsoever. It has nothing to do with debate or probable outcomes. It is entirely about triggering a visceral, immediate emotional response.
The text includes an amazing historical detail here, noting how the ancient Greeks enhanced this psychological effect by combining poetic words with specific musical rhythms and melodies.
And that observation leads to one of the most profound psychological insights in the entire manuscript.
Which is?
The author points out that even when our rational brain is fully active, even when we know for an absolute fact that the poem or the song is mathematically false or entirely fictional, our soul is still moved by it. The logic center of the brain is overwhelmed by the aesthetic center.
I want everyone listening to really think about that. You can sit in a movie theater and watch a film. Your Tier 1 rational brain knows everything you're seeing is fake.
You know the actors are standing in front of a green screen.
You know the tragic dialogue was typed by a writer in a coffee shop? You know the monster is just computer graphics. Your rational brain is screaming, "This is not real."
But then the cinematic music swells.
The lighting hits the actor's face perfectly, the poetic rhythm of the dialogue lands, and you start crying.
It's incredible.
The poetry tier has completely overridden your logic. You are experiencing genuine physical emotion based on a known fiction.
It is arguably the most powerful tool of influence. It shapes the identities of cultures, it inspires massive historical movements, and it can incite revolutions.
It operates entirely on the imagination rather than the intellect.
And if you don't realize when an argument or a piece of media is being framed poetically, you are utterly defenseless against its influence. You will follow the emotion without ever questioning the premise.
Which perfectly sets up the final, darkest tier of all. Tier 5, sophistry. In Arabic, sophista.
These are the dark arts of logic, the deliberate illusions.
When I first read this section, my immediate question was, if you have mastered the incredibly difficult science of formal logic, why would you use it to intentionally lie? Why not just use your skills to find the truth?
The manuscript provides a surprisingly cynical, yet incredibly accurate and modern answer to that question.
What does it say?
It states that sophistry is utilized by those whose ultimate goal is acquiring wealth or prestige. The Arabic term is karat jahiyya, by appearing wise to the uneducated masses.
It's clout chasing. The 15th century manuscript is warning us about logical clout chasers.
That's exactly what it is.
These are people who do not care about the truth at all. They just want to sound incredibly smart, dominate their opponents in public, and amass followers so they can get rich or famous.
That is the core of it. And the material they use to build their arguments is called wamiyat. Pure illusions. They are premises that seem incredibly true to the imagination. They feel instinctively right upon first hearing them, but the moment you put them under rational scrutiny, they completely evaporate. They rely on the audience's laziness.
And that brings us to the final phase of our deep dive, the traps.
How they actually pull it off.
Right. If we know that sophists are out there intentionally building these fragile, illusionary arguments to trick us into giving them our money, our votes, or our prestige, how exactly do they do it? What are the mechanical traps they set?
The text ends by exposing specific logical fallacies used in sophistry. The first major one it identifies is the enthymeme, or Aldemir.
The enthymeme. Break that down for us.
It's a brilliantly sneaky, weaponized tactic. To understand it, think back to the standard syllogism we discussed earlier. It has 3 parts.
Right. A universal major premise, all humans are mortal. A particular minor premise, Socrates is a human. And a conclusion, Socrates is mortal.
Exactly. What an enthymeme does is intentionally hide the major premise. It deletes the universal rule from the spoken argument.
But why is deleting a sentence so dangerous?
Because it forces the listener's brain to automatically fill in the blank. Human brains are incredibly efficient, but also dangerously lazy. We are pattern matching machines.
That's very true.
If we hear an incomplete argument, we will often subconsciously invent a flawed premise just to make the sentence make sense. The textual example the author provides is a masterclass in this manipulation. Zaid walks at night, therefore he is a thief.
Let's dissect that.
Yeah.
If someone whispers that to me at a party, Zaid walks at night, therefore he's a thief, it sounds vaguely plausible in a gossipy, suspicious way.
But if we slow down and expose the hidden premise, what is it?
Well, to make that logic mathematically work, the unstated major premise must be, everyone who walks at night is a thief.
Yes. And the moment you are forced to say that hidden premise out loud, the entire argument sounds utterly ridiculous.
Of course, not everyone who walks at night is a thief. People work night shifts at hospitals, people have insomnia, people enjoy looking at the stars.
By hiding the major premise, the sophist avoids letting you scrutinize how absurd their universal rule actually is. They just slip the toxic conclusion right past your rational defenses.
And you see this everywhere today.
Oh, all the time.
Think about a marketing slogan. This cereal is sugar-free, therefore it is healthy. The hidden premise is anything that lacks sugar is automatically healthy for the human body.
Which is demonstrably false. Drinking a cup of bleach is sugar-free, but it isn't healthy.
Or consider political rhetoric. Candidate X wants to regulate the tech industry, therefore he is an enemy of free speech.
Right. The hidden premise is any regulation of technology constitutes an attack on free speech.
If the politician said that broad rule out loud, you'd immediately argue with it. But by hiding it in an enthymeme, they trick your brain into accepting the conclusion without a fight.
It is the ultimate intellectual sleight of hand. It relies entirely on the listener not paying attention to the missing structural beam. The only way to defeat an enthymeme is to demand the speaker state their universal premise out loud.
Let's look at another trap the manuscript exposes: circular reasoning. The text refers to this as musadara, or what philosophers sometimes call petitio principii.
This is a classic.
I feel like this is the most common fallacy on television today. It's when the conclusion you are trying to prove is essentially smuggled into the premise itself. You are using the claim to prove the claim.
The author gives a very stripped-down example to highlight the absurdity of it. Trying to prove human existence by saying every human is a human.
It seems so obvious when stated like that, you'd think no one would ever fall for it.
But sophists don't state it that simply. They dress it up in complex vocabulary and aggressive delivery to obscure the circle.
Like what?
If an art dealer tells you this artifact is ancient because it dates back to antiquity, they haven't actually provided any evidence. Ancient and dating back to antiquity mean the exact same thing.
They've just walked your mind in a circle, hoping the fancy phrasing sounds like proof.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you can watch modern pundits perform musadara on cable news every single night. Oh, absolutely.
They state their conclusion aggressively, and when the host asks them for proof, they just restate the exact same conclusion using slightly more dramatic synonyms.
Like, this new policy is an absolute disaster for the economy. Why do you say that? Because it will have catastrophic financial outcomes for the nation.
Exactly. It's a circle. Disaster and catastrophic outcomes are the same claim. They provided zero empirical data, no demonstration, no syllogism.
But because they say it with intense conviction blending rhetoric with sophistry, people sitting at home nod along, thinking a point was made.
It creates the illusion of intellectual momentum. You feel like the argument is moving forward, building to a crescendo, but you were just running on a treadmill.
And Origami knew that identifying these specific fallacies was the only way to dismantle a sophist's illusion.
You have to be able to point at the argument in real time and say, you are hiding your major premise, that is an enthymeme, or you are just restating your claim, that is circular reasoning. Naming the structural flaw shatters the spell. It's like having the developer codes to the matrix of human communication.
It really is.
And that brings us to a really beautiful grounding moment at the very end of the manuscript. We have spent this entire deep dive swimming in the high atmosphere of pure philosophy, conditional propositions, and psychological manipulation. But the text ends with a profoundly physical, historical anchor. It's called the colophon.
The colophon is a traditional element in classical manuscripts. It is the scribe's final note at the very end of the copied text. It serves as a stamp of reality, a reminder that real human hands preserved this knowledge.
It tells us exactly who physically wrote this specific copy we are studying today. It was copied by a man named Belkacem bin Muhammad al-Maghrawi.
And he notes exactly when he finished his exhaustive labor.
On the eve of Saturday, the 2nd of Muharram, in the year 849 of the Hijra calendar. And he tells us exactly where he was sitting, in the heavily guarded city of Bajia, located in modern-day Algeria.
Think deeply about the historical context of that moment. Bajia, in the mid-15th century, was a major Mediterranean hub. It was a center of intense intellectual cross-pollination, but it was also a fortress city.
It was a place of high-stakes trade, intense political maneuvering, changing dynasties, and constant military tension.
Yes.
I can't help but vividly picture that scene. Outside the thick stone walls of Bajia, the world is chaotic. There are merchants in the bazaar haggling over prices, perhaps using flawed either-or propositions.
There are politicians using Tier 3 rhetoric to control anxious crowds.
There are undoubtedly sophists in the alleys trying to con people out of their wealth using wamiyat illusions.
And inside, perhaps by the flickering light of a single oil lamp, this scribe, Belkacem, is carefully, painstakingly copying out the exact mathematical rules of human thought.
He is charting the blueprints for the very arguments happening in the chaotic streets outside his window. He is preserving the code so that the next generation isn't defenseless.
It bridges the abstract philosophy and the human reality perfectly. Logic isn't just a sterile exercise for monks or academics in an ivory tower. It is the fundamental physics of human interaction.
Belkacem understood the immense value of what he was copying.
He wasn't just copying words. He was passing down the essential tools for intellectual survival in a manipulative world.
And now, almost 600 years after he put his pen down in Bijaya. Those tools have been passed directly down to you listening to this deep dive right now.
We have traveled a massive intellectual distance today.
We looked at the unshakable, empirically tested peaks of demonstration, the culturally bound norms of dialectic, the crowd-moving probable power of rhetoric.
The visceral emotional hijack of poetry, and finally, the shadowy, deceptive back alleys of sophistry.
We exposed the hidden premises of the enthymeme and the endless treadmills of circular reasoning. So, what does this all mean for you tomorrow morning?
It means that you are no longer unarmed. You are now equipped with the blueprints. And I want to leave you with a challenge to test these tools.
What's the challenge?
The very next time you are scrolling through a social media feed, watching a news broadcast, listening to a popular podcast, or even just engaged in a heated argument with someone in your life, stop for a single second. Step back, look at the invisible strings and ask yourself, which of the 5 arts is being used on me right now?
Are they giving you a rigorous, Tier 1 demonstration based on undeniable axioms and empirical facts?
Are they using Tier 2 dialectic, playing on the unspoken societal norms you were raised with, making you feel like a cultural outsider if you disagree?
Or are they blending the rhythmic, emotional manipulation of poetry with the dark arts of sophistry, using an enthymeme to sell you a fleeting feeling completely disguised as a universal fact?
Once you can see the matrix of these 5 tiers operating in the real world, once you can spot the hidden premise that someone is trying to slip past your rational mind, you can never unsee it.
You're no longer just a passive participant in the argument, swept away by the crowd. You are a structural engineer analyzing its integrity.
Think back to that massive roaring crowd we talked about at the very beginning of the show.
The cheering, the overwhelming energy, the intoxicating feeling of absolute certainty. The invisible strings are always going to be there, pulling at the masses, woven from rhetoric, poetry, and sometimes pure sophistry.
But the next time you find yourself in that crowd feeling that undeniable pull to just agree and join in,
you will know exactly how those strings were tied. Because you know how they were tied, you might just decide to cut them. Keep questioning the premises. See you next time. Usually when we talk about having an argument or a debate, there's this sort of unspoken expectation that you're on equal footing.
right, like a level playing field.
Exactly. We imagine it like a tennis match, You hit a point over the net, the other person returns it, and you just volley back and forth.
Yeah.
And the game just keeps flowing naturally because both of you, well, you both understand the boundaries of the court. You both know what a fault is. You know the rules.
Right, and I mean, that shared understanding is really the only thing that makes the rally possible. Without it, you aren't playing a game. You're just 2 people swinging rackets in the air.
But think about those moments in your life, and I know you, the listener, have definitely experienced this, where you're in a disagreement, maybe with a colleague, a boss, or even just someone online about some theoretical topic.
Oh, yeah. Online is the worst for this.
It really is. And suddenly the other person just reaches into their vocabulary and pulls out these massive, complicated, overly academic words.
The $10 word.
Yes. And they string them together
Yeah.
in a way that completely, it just shuts you down. You're standing there feeling like your tongue is tied.
Yeah, you're paralyzed.
And the worst part is you don't feel paralyzed because you think you're wrong. You feel paralyzed because you suddenly realize you don't even know the rules of the game they've decided to play.
It is the absolute definition of intellectual quicksand. I mean, you are trapped by jargon.
Right.
You know you have a valid point. Your intuition is practically screaming that their argument has a flaw. But the very tools of communication have been weaponized against you, basically to make you feel completely unequipped to respond.
And that exact universal frustration, that really visceral feeling of being silenced by someone throwing jargon at your everyday problem.
Yeah.
That is what sparked the absolute masterpiece we are exploring today.
It really is a masterpiece.
It is. We're doing a deep dive into the first half of a highly influential classical text. It's called Excerpts from Principles of Logic and the Science of Reason.
Yeah, and it's just a phenomenal piece of intellectual history. The text was written by Abu Abdullah Muhammad bin al-Sheikh al-Salih.
Okay, quite a name.
Right, but he's more widely known in the tradition as Ibn Arafa al-Wargami, or sometimes al-Tunisi. And what we're going to do today is extract the foundational building blocks of classical logic from his work.
We're looking at the raw mechanics of thought.
Exactly. We'll explore how human beings perceive reality, how we construct definitions, and, how we categorize the universe. And this is long before we even get to the complex, multi-layered arguments that most people associate with formal logic.
So the mission of this deep dive is to basically hand you, the listener, that exact same rulebook. I want to give you the mental X-ray vision to just see right through the jargon.
Which is such a powerful tool.
It really is.
Yeah.
But to truly appreciate what Ibn Arafa built here, we have to recognize that he didn't just wake up one morning and decide to write a dry textbook in a vacuum.
Not at all.
He was reacting to a very specific and honestly very toxic intellectual environment in his own time.
Yeah, he was watching a systemic breakdown in how scholars communicated. If we read the introduction to his text, he lays out his historical context with, incredible clarity.
Right.
He wrote this manual because he was observing later jurisprudence scholars, the usual scholars, the people responsible for actually deriving legal rulings. He saw them mixing their legal and theological arguments with incredibly dense, highly specialized logical terminology.
Which is basically the 14th century equivalent of a lawyer casually throwing archaic Latin phrases at you while you're just trying to dispute a parking ticket.
That is a perfect analogy.
It's designed to overwhelm you, not to clarify anything.
And Ibn Arafa explicitly calls this out. He notes that some of the scholars of his time were using this jargon specifically to silence their peers. He uses a very striking phrase, actually. He says they were rendering their opponents like a mute.
Oh, wow. Like a mute?
Yeah. I want you to really imagine the psychological weight of that. You're a scholar yourself. You have a valid legal or theological point. You clearly see the truth of a matter.
Right.
But because you haven't memorized the exact esoteric phrasing of the logical principles, because you don't know the password to the club, basically you're rendered mute. You are bullied right out of the conversation.
He's pointing out that logic, which is a science that was originally designed to be the ultimate objective tool for finding truth, it had been corrupted.
Completely corrupted.
It became a gatekeeping mechanism. It was literally a tool for intellectual bullying.
Which is what elevates this text from a mere manual to a really profound act of intellectual liberation. Ibn Arafa states that this toxic environment made it absolutely obligatory to participate in the science.
To learn it and master it.
Exactly, and to teach it widely. He wrote this concise yet remarkably thorough rule book to just level the playing field. His goal was to arm his students so they could defend themselves, strip away the intimidating terminology, and pursue the truth without being browbeaten by people hiding behind fancy words.
I love looking at it as a self-defense manual for the human mind.
That's exactly what it is.
But before we can actually start dismantling someone else's convoluted argument, the text insists we have to go back to the absolute basics, like ground zero.
Right, the foundations.
We have to understand how the mind actually acquires a piece of knowledge in the first place.
Yeah.
And that takes us to what Ibn Arafa calls the two foundational pillars of human thought.
And this is where the text demands incredible rigor from the reader, right out of the gate.
Oh, yeah.
Ibn Arafa defines knowledge broadly as absolute perception. In the Arabic terminology, this is idrak. But he doesn't leave it as a monolith. He immediately splits this absolute perception into two distinct, non-overlapping categories.
Okay, let's break those down.
Sure. The first is tasawwur, which translates to conception. And the second is tasdik, which translates to assent or judgment.
Right, I want to make sure I have the boundaries of these two pillars locked in. So, tasawwur, conception. The text describes this as perceiving something without making any sort of judgment about it whatsoever. You're just grasping the essence. And then you have tasdik, assent. This is perceiving something and making a judgment about it. So you're affirming a relationship, or you are negating a relationship.
The crucial nuance here, and the thing that usually trips up modern readers, is how the text defines that second pillar, tasdik.
How so?
Well, when we modernly hear terms like assent or judgment, our minds immediately jump to, the scientific method. We think of absolute objective certainty.
Right, empirical facts that can be measured in a lab.
Yeah, but classical logic asks us to broaden that view entirely. The text explicitly states that tasdik encompasses knowledge, yes, but also belief, opinion, illusion, and even doubt.
Wait, hold on. If I'm doubting something, I am specifically not assenting to it. That feels like a massive contradiction.
Which has at first glance, yeah.
Like, if I doubt it will rain today, I haven't made a judgment that it will rain.
This requires a complete reframing of how we view the mechanics of thought. In this classical framework, tasdik isn't a measure of how true or false a statement is in the real world. It's about the physical act of the mind attempting to make a connection. Why does it include illusion or doubt? because even in a state of doubt, your mind is weighing a proposition.
Oh, I see.
Even if that judgment is weak, even if it is equally balanced with its exact opposite, which, by the way, is the technical definition of doubt here. The mechanical mechanism in your intellect has still formed a proposition. It is still an act of tasdik. The statement doesn't have to correspond to reality for the mental gears to turn.
Ah, okay, I see the distinction. The mechanism of the mind creating a link is the tasdik.
Yes.
It's like turning the key in a car's ignition. The engine might start perfectly, it might sputter and die, or it might just explode, but the act of turning the key is the same.
That's a great way to think about it.
The existence of the mental link itself is the assent, regardless of the quality of the link.
You've got it. Whether the judgment is definitive because you have undeniable evidence, or it's highly probable or improbable or purely an illusion born from a fever dream, it all falls under the umbrella of tasdik. Your mind has committed an act of judgment.
Let's ground this with a visual analogy to make sure we've really mastered this before the text gets more complex. Let's imagine I'm doing a jigsaw puzzle.
Okay, a jigsaw puzzle.
Is tasawwur the conception part, like me picking up a single puzzle piece? I look at the shape. I see a patch of brown fur. I'm making zero assumptions about where it belongs on the board, and I'm not making a claim about what the final picture is. I'm just taking in the raw, isolated shape.
That is a perfect representation of tasawwur. It is the raw grasping of the concept, the shape, the colors, the isolated idea.
Right. And then tasdik is the moment I hold that piece up to the light and declare, this is definitely the ear of a dog. I've made a judgment.
Yes.
And even if I'm totally wrong and the final picture on the box actually turns out to be a wolf, that initial declaration I made was a tasdik.
Yeah, the moment you attribute a reality to the concept, you've crossed the threshold from conception to assent. You have formed a mental proposition. Your mind moved from merely perceiving the patch of brown fur to affirming a specific relationship about it in the world.
But knowing these classical scholars, they didn't just, high-five over those definitions and move on.
Oh, definitely not.
The text dives into a massive, highly technical scholarly debate about the internal mechanics of tasdik. Ibn Arafa details a clash between some serious intellectual heavyweights over what assent actually is.
The debate centers on the exact composition of that mental act. On one side, Ibn Arafa presents the view of Fakhr al-Din al-Razi, a towering polymath often referred to simply as al-Fakhr.
Okay, Al-Fakhr.
Razi argues that tasdik is a combination package. He asserts that it is the conception of a thing plus the judgment upon it. For Razi, assent is the sum total of those two parts.
So in my puzzle analogy, grasping the piece of cardboard A and D saying it's a dog's ear, those two actions are bundled together in a single envelope labeled tasdik.
That is Razi's position, but then you have the ancients, the earlier philosophers in the tradition, who fiercely argue that tasdik is only the spark of judgment itself.
It's just the spark.
Right. Yes, they acknowledge that you must conceive of the thing first. I mean, conception is a necessary prerequisite. You can't judge a puzzle piece you haven't picked up.
Obviously.
But the tasdik itself is purely and solely that isolated moment of judgment. And the text goes quite deep into the logical paradoxes raised against both sides.
What kind of paradoxes are we talking about here? How do you attack the idea that it's a combination?
A major objection raised by another scholar, Ibn al-Badi, targets Razi's combination theory. Ibn al-Badi points out a flaw in how we define wholes and parts.
Okay, math time.
Right. If tasdik is the sum total of conception and judgment, then you run into a mathematical wall where a part cannot truly define the whole. If the whole requires both A and B and you only have A, the definition collapses.
Because if the whole entity is literally A plus B,
Yeah.
I can't point to A and say, there is the whole thing, and I can't point to B and say, there's the whole thing.
Exactly. Furthermore, Ibn al-Badi argues that if you try to save the theory by saying tasdik is just conception conditioned by judgment, then the judgment itself falls completely outside the essence of the thing.
Oh, I see.
The judgment just becomes external wrapping paper, not the gift itself. The text shows scholars like Al-Athir and Al-Siraj leaping into the fray to defend various definitions, arguing intensely about how the human intellect actually divides and categorizes its own internal processes.
It is genuinely incredible how microscopic their analysis is. I mean, they are putting the fleeting, almost invisible act of having a thought under a microscope and dissecting its anatomy.
They really are.
But taking all this deep theory, I'm going to pull this forward to the modern listener's daily life. Because when I look at the difference between tasawwur just grasping a concept and tasdik actually making a measured judgment, I feel like this text is diagnosing a modern disease.
That's a really interesting way to put it.
We live in an era of just unprecedented information overload. We have infinite scrolling, 24-hour news cycles, and algorithms firing thousands of disparate posts at us every single day.
Yeah, nonstop.
Are we essentially just being bombarded with too much raw to solve? Like, are we just drowning in endless floating puzzle pieces without ever having the time or, honestly, the mental bandwidth to form accurate tasdik?
That is a brilliant application of the classical framework. If we look at the modern digital crisis through Ibn Arafa's eyes, that is exactly what is happening. The internet is basically an engine of pure tasawwur.
Just firing concepts at us.
Right. We acquire concepts at a terrifying velocity. We catch a fragmented headline. We watch a 15-second video out of context. We read a localized soundbite. But true, measured tasdeed, the process of evaluating that concept and forming a reality-based judgment that requires deliberate, slow mental effort.
And because we don't have the time to do this slow work, our minds just, well, they default to the weakest forms of judgment.
We default to the lower tiers of tasdik that the text mentioned earlier: opinion, illusion, and doubt. We parrot a pundit's belief because we don't have the time to form our own knowledge. The danger is that the sheer volume of tasawwur tricks us.
So,
We mistake having a massive, chaotic pile of puzzle pieces on the table for having successfully completed the puzzle.
wow. We confuse awareness with understanding.
Exactly.
That is a sobering thought, and it provides the perfect transition into the next major theme of the text. Because if our minds are this vulnerable, if we can so easily slip from perceiving a concept into forming a completely broken, illusory judgment about it, how do we fix the machine? Like, what is the failsafe?
The text provides the failsafe explicitly. Ibn Arafa states that because the intellect itself frequently makes mistakes as it travels from tasawwur to tasdik, it desperately requires a universal law.
A rule book.
Right. It needs a rule book to protect it from its own inherent flaws. And that rule book, that mental law, is logic.
He describes logic as a protective barrier. If you observe the law, it protects your thought process from essentially careening off a cliff.
That's the goal.
But true to form, the author doesn't just hand over the law and tell us to memorize it. He immediately throws the reader into a dizzying philosophical paradox about how a human being could ever possibly learn this law in the first place.
Yes, the paradox of acquiring logic. It's a fascinating dilemma. The text asks, is the knowledge of logic necessary? Meaning, is it innate, intuitive, something you are simply born knowing without needing any proof?
Okay.
Or is logic theoretical, meaning it is acquired, learned from scratch, and requires a complex process of reasoning to finally understand?
And as I read that section, I realized it's a trap.
Oh, completely.
Because if logic is strictly necessary and completely innate to the human soul, then why did Ibn Arafa write a book about it? Why are we reading it? You don't need a manual for something you already possess perfectly.
Right.
But if it's entirely theoretical and must be learned,
Right.
well, what tool do you use to learn it?
You've hit the exact paradox. If logic is entirely theoretical, you would logically need some pre-existing system of logic to help your brain process and learn that new theoretical logic.
Which means?
But then the question becomes, how did you learn that pre-existing system? You would need another logic before that, and another before that. The text refers to this terrifying philosophical concept as tasalsul, which means infinite regress.
It's the mental equivalent of standing between two mirrors and watching your reflection repeat endlessly into the dark.
That's exactly what it is.
If I need a dictionary to understand the words, but I need to understand the words to read the dictionary, I can never read a single page. I am paralyzed at the starting line. So how do the scholars break this hall of mirrors? How do we escape the infinite regress?
Ibn Arafa, drawing on the consensus of scholars like Al-Kunaji and Al-Siraj, resolves the paradox by concluding that human knowledge is a hybrid.
A hybrid, okay.
It is a mixture. The human mind comes pre-installed with some necessary, innate logical truths. These are fundamental realities that are simply self-evident to a functioning intellect.
Just baked into the hardware.
Exactly. And that small, unshakable core of innate truth serves as the crucial pathway to acquire all the rest of the theoretical, complex knowledge.
So to put that into practice,
Yeah.
I don't need to be born with the innate ability to perform quantum physics or advanced calculus, but my brain is born with the innate, necessary understanding that one object is fundamentally separate from a different object.
Yes.
Or the innate understanding of non-contradiction, that a thing cannot be entirely black and entirely white at the exact same moment. I use those basic biological realities to eventually build the calculus.
Spot on. Al-Khunaji and Al-Athir emphasize that grasping just a few of these foundational innate pathways is entirely sufficient to build the most towering complex systems of philosophical reasoning. You leverage the necessary to unlock the theoretical.
There is a deep comfort in that resolution for anyone trying to learn something difficult today.
I think so too.
Think about when you sit down with a dense philosophical text, or maybe you're forced to learn a massive new software architecture at work, or you're trying to understand the tax code. You feel completely overwhelmed.
Oh, absolutely.
But the classical logicians are telling you across the centuries, you don't need to know everything to start. You don't need the entire theoretical framework downloaded into your brain on day one.
Yeah, you don't.
You just need to identify a few necessary truths, a few basic, unshakable anchors in the material, and trust your innate mental tools to start building the scaffolding outward from there.
It is a highly empowering view of human capability.
Mhm.
Your mind already has the starter kit. You just have to do the work to build the structure.
Right.
But as the text points out, to actually build that scaffolding, to use this law of the mind out in the real world with other people, we have to master the primary tool the mind relies on to express itself. And that tool is language. Words.
We've established that logic is the mental scaffolding. But you can't build a scaffold out of thin air. You need physical building materials. In human communication, that material is words.
Exactly.
But how does a random sound coming out of my mouth or a squiggle of ink on a piece of paper actually lock onto a complex concept in reality? The text breaks this down into three unbelievably strict categories of meaning, known as dala dalaft olaf.
The architecture of meaning. This is where classical logic demands total precision. The text categorizes how a word indicates a meaning into three avenues: mutabaka, tadamun, and iltizam.
Let's tackle the first one, mutabaka.
Right, which translates to correspondence. This occurs when a word perfectly, entirely, and without remainder matches its complete meaning.
Okay.
The standard classical example is the word human, indicating a rational animal. The word covers the entire essence of the concept. It is a one-to-one, flawless fit.
So if I say the word car, and in my mind I mean the entire vehicle, the chassis, the engine, the wheels, the steering wheel, every single component that makes the car what it is, that is mutabaka. Perfect correspondence.
Exactly.
What happens in the second category?
The second category is tadamun, translating to inclusion. This is when a word indicates only a part of its total meaning. Imagine you're driving, you hit a pothole, and you pull over and say, "Oh no, the car is flat."
Oh, right.
In the context of that sentence, the word car is being used to refer almost exclusively to the tire. The tire is a part included within the total meaning of the car. The word is indicating a fraction of its whole.
That feels very natural. We use language like that all day long to save time.
We do.
But the third category, iltizam, which means implication or necessary consequence, seems to be where the classical scholars really drew their swords. The text defines this as when a word points to an outside concept that mentally accompanies the original word.
Right.
The classic example provided is that hearing the word ceiling implies the existence of a wall.
And this specific category triggered a fierce debate regarding where that implication actually lives. Must the implication be purely mental, restricted strictly to the internal logic of the intellect? Or can it be external, based on how things physically happen to exist in the outside world?
Let me test my understanding of this with an anecdote. A few years ago, a friend of mine bought a house. He told me he bought a house, and I assumed naturally that it had a garage.
Okay, sure.
When I visited, there was no garage, and I was genuinely surprised. So, in this framework, mutabaka is the whole physical building he bought. Tadamun might be me referring just to his living room.
Right.
But my mind automatically jumped to garage when he said house. Was that iltizam? Was I engaging in logical implication?
The classical scholars would look at your anecdote and say, absolutely not. You were engaging in subjective association, not logical implication.
Ouch.
And this is exactly why the debate over external versus mental necessity is so crucial. The scholar Ibn al-Hajib tried to argue that implication could be external, that because houses in your neighborhood generally have garages, the word house implies garage.
Which makes sense to me.
But the text, aligning with the majority of logicians, violently rejects this. True iltizam, valid logical implication, requires an unbreakable mental necessity.
Wait, I want to challenge that. Why is my association invalid? Doesn't implication vary wildly depending on who you were talking to?
Well,
Like, if I say the word dog, My immediate mental implication is loyalty or fluffy companion. But if someone else was viciously attacked by a dog when they were a child, their immediate mental implication is danger or teeth. Isn't the consequence of a word entirely subjective to the human experiencing it?
The fact that you just brought up subjective trauma and cultural association is the exact reason Ibn Arafa's rules are so terrifyingly rigid here. In formal classical logic, iltizam cannot be subjective.
It can't.
No. It cannot rely on your memory, your culture, your neighborhood, or your emotions. It must be a necessary mental consequence. That means it is literally impossible for a functioning human intellect to understand concept A without being forced by the sheer laws of reality to simultaneously understand concept B.
So it's not word association. It has nothing to do with what pops into my head first. It's logical gravity.
That is a phenomenal way to put it, logical gravity. To truly conceive of the concept of ceiling, your intellect is forced, by the very definition of a ceiling, to understand the concept of wall or vertical support. A ceiling cannot exist in a vacuum. It requires a boundary holding it up.
I see.
If you just associate dog with fluffy, that is an external accidental association. The human intellect can easily conceive of a dog that has no hair.
Like a hairless terrier or something.
Exactly. Therefore, fluffy is not a necessary mental implication of the essence of dog. The text demands that for an implication to be used in a logical argument, understanding the first thing must mathematically force you to understand the second thing.
The discipline required to think like that is staggering. But I see the wisdom in it. If we allow subjective associations into our formal logic, the entire system degrades into, well, that's just my truth, and this is your truth.
Exactly, and then you lose the shared tennis court.
Right. Ibn Arafa is building a fortress against rhetorical manipulation. He's telling his students, your personal feelings about a word do not count as logical implications. Stick to the essence.
The intellect must recognize the bond as unbreakable. The text even mentions that heavyweights like Fakhr al-Din al-Razi debated whether a necessary consequence had to be instantly obvious, what they call bayan, or if it could take a moment of deep reflection to realize.
And what did they decide?
Regardless of the speed of realization, the consensus holds firm. The connection must be undeniable to the intellect once perceived.
So we've established how words hold precise meaning, and we've erected massive guardrails against sloppy subjective associations. Once we have these purified clinical meanings, we need a filing system to hold them. We have to organize all the chaotic reality around us into manageable boxes. And this leads us to the core categorization system of the classical mind, the 5 universals, known as al-Kulliyat al-Kams.
This is the ultimate filing cabinet of reality. The text divides all universal concepts into 5 strict, distinct layers that nest within one another. The premise is bold but simple. Every single definable thing in the universe can be placed into this system.
I want to make this tangible. I invite you, the listener, to do a mental exercise with us right now. Look around wherever you happen to be listening to this.
Yeah, play along.
Maybe you're driving in your car, sitting at your desk, or folding laundry. Pick a physical object near you. We're going to use a modern smartphone as our example, but you can follow along with whatever you choose. We're going to run a smartphone through the 5 universals to demonstrate how rigorous these thinkers were at classifying existence.
Let's run the diagnostic. The first universal is gens, or genus. This is a broad concept applied to many things that differ in their fundamental species. It answers the basic question, what is it, at a macro level. In the ancient texts, the genus for human is animal.
So for our smartphone, the gens would be something like electronic device, because that broad category applies to many things that are fundamentally completely different from each other.
Right.
A smartphone is an electronic device, but so is a microwave, a television, and a heart monitor. They share the genus.
Perfect. The second universal zooms in. It is na, or species. This is a concept applied to many things that share the exact same fundamental reality or essence. Under the broad genus of animal, the specific species is human.
Moving down the hierarchy for our object, under the broad genus of electronic device, our species, the na, is smartphone. Because my iPhone, my friend's Samsung Galaxy, and a Google Pixel, despite having entirely different branding and operating systems, share the exact same fundamental reality. They are the same species of device.
Now we arrive at the critical third universal, the pivot point of logic, phasal, which translates to difference. This is the essential defining attribute that separates a specific species from everything else within its shared genus.
The dividing line.
Exactly. For humans, classical logic asserts the genus is animal, And the difference is rational. We are the rational animals. Rationality is our phasal.
This is where it gets tricky. What is the phasal for a smartphone? What essence separates the species smartphone from the rest of the genus electronic device? We can't say it's because it has a glass screen, because televisions have glass screens.
Right.
We can't say it's because it computes data, because the laptop computes data. The difference has to be the exact combination of essential traits.
Yeah.
Right? Something like a pocket-sized cellular connected computer. That unique essential reality is the difference.
Yes, that distinguishing essence is its phasal. Now, as you might expect, the text spends an enormous amount of time detailing a major philosophical clash regarding this exact universal, the difference.
Oh, here we go.
And this debate gets to the very heart of how reality is constructed metaphysically.
I'm always here for 14th century academic drama. Who is fighting, and what are they fighting about regarding the difference?
The debate is a battle over causality. The core question is the difference the actual cause of the species' existence? The text quotes a figure referred to simply as the sheik.
And who is the sheik?
In these classical logical texts, the sheik almost universally refers to the towering philosopher Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna.
Okay, Avicenna. Got it.
Ibn Sina argued forcefully that the difference must be the metaphysical cause that makes the species exist within the genus. His reasoning is that if the components of an essence, the genus and the difference, are not causally linked to one another, then they are completely independent floating concepts.
And if they're independent?
They cannot fuse to form a single, unified reality.
Let me translate that into our terms. Ibn Sina is arguing that rationality isn't just a convenient name tag we slap on humans to tell us apart from horses. He's arguing that rationality is the actual active engine, the cause that forces the human share of the animal genus to exist in reality. The attribute creates the entity.
That is Ibn Sina's stance. But then Fakhr al-Din al-Razi steps into the arena and vehemently denies this premise entirely.
Classic Razi.
Razi counters by arguing that the phasal is ultimately an attribute, a descriptive characteristic, and a mere attribute cannot be the foundational cause of the very thing it is supposed to describe. To use your translation, the adjective does not create the noun. The adjective merely describes a noun that must already exist.
That is a massive philosophical chasm. So where does our author, Ibn Arafa, acting as the referee, land on this? Does he side with the towering legacy of Ibn Sina or the fierce pushback of Razi?
Ibn Arafa explicitly sides against Ibn Sina's causality theory. He drops a very potent, disciplined line in the text stating, "Mental realities aren't proven by mere probabilities."
Wise.
Ibn Arafa argues that injecting causality here is an unproven assumption that oversteps the bounds of logic. He concedes that the difference distinguishes the species conceptually, yes, but we cannot make the massive leap to claiming it is the metaphysical cause of its existence.
He's drawing a line.
Exactly. He demands that logic remain strictly grounded in categorization, resisting the seductive pull into speculative metaphysics.
I love the discipline of that. He's essentially saying, keep your grandiose philosophy out of my filing system. We're just here to sort things.
That's exactly it.
All right, so we have genus, species, and difference. The core essence is mapped. What are the final two universals on the periphery?
The fourth is kasa, or property. This is an attribute that is specific and unique to one species, but, and this is vital, it is not essential to its reality. It is a unique side effect of being that species.
Like what?
The classic enduring example is laughing for humans. As far as the classical logicians observed, only humans laugh. It is unique to us. But laughing doesn't define what a human is. If a human is born without the physical ability to laugh or just goes their whole life without finding anything funny, they do not cease to be human.
Right. If we saw a hyena laughing, the classical logicians wouldn't say the hyena became human. They would just say they need to update their list of properties.
Exactly.
So for our smartphone, a property, a kasa, might be something like running iOS or Android mobile applications. Only smartphones and their tablet cousins really utilize that specific mobile app ecosystem in that way. It's unique to them, but it's a software side effect. It's not the essential physical definition of the hardware itself.
That's a solid mapping. And that brings us to the fifth and final universal, eridam, or general accident. This is a non-essential attribute that is shared across multiple species indiscriminately. The classic example is walking.
Because lots of things walk.
Right. Humans walk, but so do horses, dogs, and cats. It doesn't define our essence, and it certainly isn't unique to us.
So for the smartphone, a general accident and art am would be something unfortunately common, like having a cracked screen A smartphone can have a cracked screen, but so can a television, a smartwatch, or a laptop. It is a completely non-essential state of being that randomly happens to many different species of devices.
You have now perfectly categorized reality. By using these 5 tools, you know the object's broad family, which is the genus, its specific nature, the species, what essentially makes it unique, the difference, what non-essentially makes it unique, the property, and what states it shares randomly with other things, the general accident.
Now, here is where all this incredibly dense groundwork pays off. Why do we care? Why do generations of scholars obsess over these 5 universals?
This is the best part.
Because, as Ibn Arafa reveals next, these universals are the only mathematical tools you are allowed to use to define anything. If you don't use these, your definition is garbage.
Oh.
This moves us into the crucible of the text, the rigorous art of defining things.
This is the practical payoff of everything we've learned. Ibn Arafa lays down 4 incredibly strict formulas or recipes for defining a concept. And if your opponent in a debate doesn't follow these formulas, whatever they are saying is structurally, logically invalid.
It is quite literally a recipe book for truth. Let's walk through the 4 recipes.
The first, the gold standard and the most powerful tool in logic, is the had tam, or the perfect definition. The recipe for this is strict. You must use the proximate genus plus the difference.
Okay, proximate genus plus difference.
So returning to our classics. Animal, the immediate genus plus rational, the essential difference equals human. It gives you the immediate family and the essential uniqueness. It is bulletproof.
Continuing our analogy, electronic device plus pocket-sized cellular computer. You have locked the smartphone into a perfect definition. There's no wiggle room.
Yeah.
What is the second recipe?
The second is had nakis, or the imperfect definition. This occurs when you use the difference alone without a genus, or you use a distant genus plus the difference.
The distant genus.
Yeah, so instead of using animal, which is the closest proximate genus, you zoom out too far and use living body, a distant genus plus rational. It's technically true, but it's imperfect because it's too broad before it gets specific.
Like defining a smartphone by saying it's a physical object that acts as a cellular computer. It's true, but physical object is way too broad a starting point. It's sloppy categorization. What is the third recipe?
The third is razum tam, which translates to the perfect description. Notice the crucial shift in vocabulary from definition to description.
Description.
The recipe here is proximate genus plus the property, the casa, so animal plus laughing. It successfully isolates humans from everything else in reality, but it does so using a non-essential side effect. Therefore, it only describes the surface. It doesn't truly define the hidden essence.
Oh, that is a huge distinction. So it's like saying a smartphone is an electronic device that runs the TikTok app. That statement might isolate the smartphone perfectly on a table full of objects, but it doesn't tell me what the fundamental essence of the machine actually is.
You nailed it. And the fourth and weakest recipe is razum nakis, the imperfect description. This is just using the property alone or a distant genus plus the property, a physical object that runs TikTok. It is the absolute weakest, most fragile form of identifying something in a debate.
I look at these 4 recipes, and I have a profound realization about human psychology and modern rhetoric. We argue online constantly. We debate politics, economics, social issues, and almost all of our most vicious, unending conflicts happen because politicians and pundits are using imperfect descriptions while demanding we treat them as perfect definitions.
That is the exact mechanism of manipulation Ibn Arafa was fighting. Let's explore why people do that. A had tam, a perfect definition, is hard work. It requires identifying absolute essences, which leaves you vulnerable to being proven wrong.
Right.
But a razum nakis, in an imperfect description based on a flashy side effect or an emotional property, is easy, and it resonates with a crowd. It connects directly to a fundamental rule the text establishes about what makes a definition valid in the first place. A definition must be clearer and priorly conceived compared to the thing being defined.
Priorly conceived, that's a pretty dense phrase. Walk me through what that means in the context of arguing.
It means you cannot use the thing itself to define the thing. It is a strike against circular definitions. The text raises a heavy critique against this. If you ask me what the concept of motion is, and I define it by saying it is the act of moving, my definition is invalid.
Because you're just using the word to define the word.
Exactly. The concept of moving is not priorly conceived to the concept of motion. It is the exact same concept wearing a different hat. Furthermore, scholars like Al-Kunaji and Al-Siraj fiercely debate how we can ever define a complex whole by listing its parts if we don't already understand those parts independently.
The whole and the parts again.
Yes. The golden rule is, if the definition you offer is more obscure, or just as obscure as the word itself, it fails entirely as a definition.
Which brings us full circle to the historical context. Is this exact rhetorical sleight of hand why Ibn Arafa was so frustrated at the beginning of the text?
Almost certainly.
Were the scholars winning major legal and theological arguments by using circular logic and sloppy, imperfect descriptions, and then battering their opponents with jargon so they wouldn't notice the flaw?
That is exactly the diagnosis. If a scholar builds an entire sweeping theological ruling on a rasum nicis, an imperfect description based merely on a non-essential property, they are building a massive castle on a foundation of sand.
Right.
But if they use dense, intimidating jargon to disguise that sand as bedrock, the opponent is silenced. Ibn Arafa wrote this to give his students the X-ray vision to see the sand. He's teaching them to interrupt the debate and say, hold on, you haven't given me a had tam, a perfect definition. You are merely describing a side effect. Your entire argument is structurally invalid until you define your essence.
I can't overstate how much of a superpower that is.
Yeah.
To be able to listen to a politician's speech or a demanding boss or a complex news article and instantly categorize the core of their argument. Nope, that's just a distant genus and a general accident. You haven't actually defined anything. You're just making noise.
It's incredibly empowering.
Okay, so we have secured our foundation. We know how to acquire a concept. We know how to define it perfectly. The final step in the first half of this classical manual is learning how to put those perfectly defined concepts together to make a statement about the real world. We're moving from the bricks to the architecture. Let's look at building statements, propositions, and quantifiers.
We finally arrived at the actual machinery of logic. The text moves to the qadiyya, which translates to proposition. The most basic logical statement you can make is a categorical proposition, or hemlia. And the formula requires three distinct components: a subject, a predicate, and a copula that explicitly links them together.
Keep it simple for me. Give me an example of the basic formula.
The sky is blue. The sky is the subject, the thing we're talking about. Blue is the predicate, the attribute we are assigning. Is the copula the mathematical link confirming the relationship?
That seems almost insultingly simple. But knowing the scholars we're dealing with, I know there's a trapdoor right behind it.
There is always a trapdoor, because the text immediately introduces the crucial concept of the sur, or the quantifier. The quantifier is the word that tells us the exact mathematical scope of the subject.
The scope.
Right. A proposition without a quantifier is like a wild animal. It can't be controlled in a debate. The text lays out the four possible quantifiers that determine the rigid boundaries of any logical argument.
Let's lay them out on the table.
First, the universal affirmative. All A is B. For example, all humans are mortal. It encompasses 100% of the subject. Second, the particular affirmative. Some A is B. For example, some humans are writers. It affirms a portion.
Okay.
Third, the universal negative. No A is B. For example, no humans are immortal. It denies the predicate to 100% of the subject.
And the fourth.
Fourth, the particular negative. Not all A is B or some A is not B. For example, some humans are not writers.
Again, these sound like basic grammar rules, but they form the entire unshakable foundation of syllogisms. But before we get to how powerful they are in a debate, I have to ask you about the most bizarre, fascinating concept the text dives into here.
The deviated proposition.
Yes. The scholars become obsessed with something called deviated propositions, or medulla. What on earth makes a proposition deviated?
A deviated proposition is a brilliant, highly dangerous logical construct. Normally, if you want to make a negative statement, you attack the copula. You negate the link. You say, the man does not see. You take the subject, the man, and the predicate seeing, and you violently sever the link between them with the word not. That is a standard, safe, negative proposition.
Okay, so how do you deviate it? Where does the negative go?
In a deviated proposition, instead of severing the link, the negative is baked directly into the subject or the predicate itself. This creates a new, grammatically affirmative statement about a negative concept.
Wait, run that by me again.
So instead of saying, the man does not see, which breaks the link, you say, the man is non-seeing. You are positively affirming the bizarre predicate of non-seeing onto the man.
The man is non-seeing. Honestly, that sounds like a meaningless semantic trick. It sounds like something a lawyer says to confuse a jury. Why does a system as rigorous as classical logic care about the microscopic difference between does not see and is non-seeing?
Because that microscopic grammatical difference leads to a massive reality-breaking existential debate. And this is where Fakhr al-Din al-Razi re-enters the fray to cause trouble. Razi asks a profound question about reality. Does a subject actually have to physically exist in reality to have a negative predicate applied to it?
Okay, my brain just stuttered. I'm going to need you to ground that with an example. What is Razi actually asking?
Let's test your intuition. Think about a completely mythical creature. The phoenix.
Okay, the phoenix.
We agree the phoenix does not physically exist in reality. So if I ask you to evaluate the standard negative statement, the phoenix does not see, is that statement true or false?
Well, I would say it's true. The phoenix doesn't exist, so it doesn't have a body, so it doesn't have eyes, so it doesn't see. The statement the phoenix does not see is a true statement about reality.
Correct. In standard logic, a negative proposition does not see can be absolutely true even if the subject doesn't exist, because you are merely confirming the absence of a link. But let's look at the deviated proposition. Evaluate this statement. The phoenix is non-seeing.
I mean, it's the same thing, right? The phoenix is non-seeing. It makes perfect sense.
Ah, but you have fallen into the trap. Look closely at the copula. The phoenix is. The word is implies that there is a phoenix there to be something. It affirms a positive state of being onto the subject.
Oh, wow. Is non-seeing treats the absence of sight as an actual physical attribute, like having red feathers.
Exactly. Razi and the other scholars debate this endlessly. To say A is B, logic demands that A must physically exist to receive the attribute B. If you say the phoenix is non-seeing, you are treating non-seeing as a tangible attribute that you are actively attaching to a subject.
But the subject isn't there.
Exactly. You logically cannot attach an attribute to a subject that does not exist. Therefore, the deviated statement, the phoenix is non-seeing, is mathematically false, while the standard statement, the phoenix does not see, is mathematically true.
My mind is genuinely blown. This isn't just wordplay. This gets into deep, deep questions of existence. Can we make logical rules about ghosts? Can we assign attributes to things that aren't there? The classical scholars recognize that human language can actually trick us into assigning reality to non-existent things, just by how we format our adjectives.
This is the ultimate intimidating precision of the classical mind. They understood that if you allow a deviated proposition about a non-existent subject to be treated as true, you break the fundamental rule that affirmative propositions require the existence of the subject.
And if you break that?
If you break that rule, you start building logical castles out of thin air. You start proving the existence of anything you want just by manipulating negative prefixes.
So, bringing all this theory back down to earth, what does this mean for the listener? Why does mastering these basic quantifiers all, some, no, not all, and understanding the exact microscopic placement of a negative word actually matter in daily life? Let me pitch a theory. It matters because the word some is just as powerful as the word all if you know how to wield it.
Yeah.
Tell me how mastering this strips away the manipulative power of absolute statements in an argument.
Mastering quantifiers is the ultimate rhetorical defense mechanism. Most manipulation in modern rhetoric, especially in politics or media, relies heavily on false universals. A politician or a pundit will get on television and say, all of these people are dangerous, or no one believes this policy will work.
Yeah, we hear that every day.
They intentionally use the universal affirmative or the universal negative to completely overwhelm you. If you don't have classical logical training, your instinct is to try and fight them by using another universal. No, you're wrong. None of them are dangerous.
Right.
And suddenly you are trapped in an unwinnable binary shouting match where both sides are technically wrong.
Because proving a universal negative, proving that not a single person out of a million is dangerous, is statistically impossible. You lose the debate before you even open your mouth. But if you know the rule book...
If you know Ibn Arafa's rule book, you know the secret of contradiction. The exact mathematical logical contradiction of a universal affirmative. All A is B is not a universal negative. No A is B.
It's not.
No. The true contradiction is the particular negative. Not all A is B, or some A is not B. So when someone aggressively says, all of these people are dangerous, you do not have to take on the impossible burden of proving that none of them are. You only have to prove that some of them are not.
Wow.
A single solitary exception mathematically shatters their universal statement. Mastering the quantifier some allows you to dismantle absolute manipulative statements with surgical precision without ever stepping into their trap.
You just calmly take out a pen, pop their massive universal balloon with the tiny word some, and watch their entire argument deflate on the table. It is brilliant.
It completely strips away the power of intellectual bullying. You are no longer silenced like a mute, as the author feared. You can demand perfect definitions, you can reject subjective implications, and you can hold their sweeping propositions accountable to strict quantifiers.
And that brings us to the end of our journey through the first half of this classical manual. We've covered an immense amount of ground. Let's trace our steps. We started at the very ground floor, looking at the raw biological materials of human thought, conceptions, tasawwur, and a sense tasdik.
Right.
We learned that merely picking up a puzzle piece is different from judging where it goes, and that our judgments can be riddled with illusion, doubt, and opinion if we aren't careful.
And from that foundation, we look at how words carry meaning from the mind to the world through correspondence, inclusion, and strict, inescapable logical implication. We categorized all of chaotic reality into the neat filing system of the 5 universals: genus, species, difference, property, and general accident.
We then use those universals as recipes to build bulletproof definitions. We learn the crucial difference between a perfect definition that captures an unshakable essence and an imperfect description that only captures a fleeting side effect. And finally, we constructed measurable propositions, learning the existential danger of deviated statements and the immense mathematical power of quantifiers.
And through it all, we must remember the human context. This isn't just a dusty history lesson about 14th century scholars arguing over semantics. Ibn Arafa wrote this because he saw real people being manipulated.
Yes, exactly.
This text is an intellectual shield. If you can break down someone's argument, if you can see that they're using a rasm nakis, an imperfect description, to mask a weak point, you can demand clarity. You can force them to play by the rules.
You can see the matrix of their argument. Before we sign off, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought that builds on everything we've discussed today, pulling it right into the present moment.
Consider this. Classical logic demands that before we are even mathematically allowed to disagree on a proposition, we must perfectly define our terms using shared universals. We have to absolutely agree on the tasawwur, the conception, before we can ever begin to debate the tasdik, the judgment.
That's mandatory.
Look at almost any major societal debate today. Look at the furious arguments raging on your newsfeed. Are we actually disagreeing on the judgment, the tasdik? Or did we completely and totally fail to share the same initial concept, the tasawwur?
Oh, that hits hard. If my tasawwur of a complex word like freedom or justice or success is fundamentally different from your tasawwur, we aren't even having the same argument. We're playing 2 different sports on 2 different fields, just screaming at each other across the parking lot.
Precisely. We are viciously fighting over a tasdik when the underlying tasawwur is completely broken. So the question I leave you to mull over is this. How many of your daily conflicts, your political arguments, your frustrations with your peers or your partner are just optical illusions? Illusions caused by undefined words, unshared concepts, and a failure to establish the proximate genus.
We think we're debating the results of the X-ray, but the machine itself is completely broken. We're just pointing at murky waters and calling it precision. It's a humbling thought, but also an incredibly empowering one, because now, thanks to Ibn Arafa, you have the tools to fix the machine. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the definitions, keep looking for the tasawwur, and keep diving deep.